Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to our 8th annual Cuyahoga County Conference on Social Welfare. My name is Victoria Marion, and it's been a plum-pleasing pleasure to be on the Voluntary Leadership Committee again this year. And so without any further ado, we try not to start late, but we knew because of the parking and because of the weather, we wanted to give you a few more minutes. But if everything goes well, we will have our welcome from the Dean.
Good morning. As Dean of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to Case Western Reserve University today for the 2018 Cuyahoga County Conference on Social Welfare. The Mandel School is very honored to be hosting this important regional social work conference with Cleveland State University and NASW Ohio. Now, more than ever, social work is essential. And social workers like you are the change agents who will continue to transform our communities for the better. The conference theme, Lessons Learned, Practical Strategies for Healthy and Effective Practitioner, also shines a necessary spotlight on the importance of practice and of caring for others, and just as importantly for ourselves. I'm thrilled to see so many Mandel School faculty members and alumni among your presenters today. They are sharing their practical knowledge and cutting-edge work in trauma, aging, advocacy, inclusion, big data, and so many other vital and exciting topics. I thank you for being a part of the future of social work by being here. And I hope your time on our campus today at this conference is educational, energizing, and inspiring. Have a great day.
And so now I'll introduce our moderator for the keynote panel, and that's Latoya Logan. And Latoya is our Region 3 Director for NASW.
Okay, so I think you go let's get up on the stage.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome. I am ecstatic to be here today. I am a proud social worker, and I am extremely proud to serve as each of you as the Region 3 Director for NSAW. Happy Social Work Month. Happy Women's Month. Okay. This year's theme, Lessons Learned, Practical Strategies for Healthy and Effective Practitioners, was designed with each of you in mind. Purposefully acknowledging the political climate and the impact it has had on the services we provide and will continue to provide, the conference is tasked with providing tangible advice, information, and ideas geared toward working together and supporting each of you in the roles you serve. We are living and working in a unique time, but we have been here before, faced the challenge, and persevered. The panelists will share their unique experiences with adversity, funding limitations, and service barriers while providing insight as to how they remained fresh, energetic, and impassioned. So I'd like to begin with Ms. Pamela Bradford, if you join me on stage. Ms. Bradford has over 40 years of experience as a social worker. She received her BSW from the University of Cincinnati shortly after the School of Social Work was established and accredited in 1972. She majored in community organization. Pamela quite intentionally wanted to contrast the experience of going to a school with a population of 30,000 to a small college and graduate school. Oh, come on now. Come on. Okay, have a seat. Take a seat. She attended a historically black college school, Atlanta University. The School of Social Work had 4 classrooms and a total of 16 students. She received her MSW in Autonomous Clinical Social Work. The educational philosophy of the school at that time was that graduates of its program should be able to be successful in the practice of social work wherever they landed. Pamela's professional experience has been quite rich and varied. She has worked as a social worker at a home for abused and neglected children. She has worked as a social work salesperson, marketing clinical services to local Cleveland businesses. She has taught as an adjunct instructor for over 20 years. She was the director of a multi-service program for children and youth for over 20 years. I mean, clearly she's done a lot, right? Okay. She looks forward to sharing her perspectives on the challenges and opportunities of working in the field of social worker. Next, we'd like to welcome Mr. Larry Bresler to the stage. Mr. Bresler is the executive director of the Organize Ohio, an organization that advances grassroots community organizing and assists community organizing efforts as a strategy for progressive change in Ohio. He has a master's degree in social work from Case Western Reserve University and a law degree from Cleveland State University. He has over 45 years of experience in nonprofit management and community organizing. His community organizing experience ranges from urban to rural and neighborhood-based to statewide and national campaigns. Among his positions have included National Director of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights, Cleveland Settlement House, Director of a statewide health justice organization in Ohio, and Manager of Neighborhood Planning and Development for the City of Cleveland. He served as an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University since 2006, where he teaches a wide range of classes in macro practice and poverty. Thank you. Next, we will welcome Ms. Kathleen Stoll to the stage. Kathleen has had a lifetime commitment to the improvement of services to the mentally ill. She began her career at Cleveland State Hospital, where she participated actively in its reform of treatment programs, research projects, and then wrote the plan for the closure of the facilities in 1973. From there, she became the Associate Director of the First Mental Health Board for 10 years and assisted in the development of many of the agencies and services funded by the board. She continued in her role in the development of psychiatric services for children and assisted with the development of a psychobiological research center at the University Hospital Planning Office. Kathleen participated as a staff member on the master plan for university hospitals and University Circle. Kathleen has degrees from Smith College and Case Western University, including an earned MBA from the Weatherhead School of Management and an MSSA from the Mandel School. She is the recipient of many awards, and actually there's so many, I'm not gonna name them here because we might be here for a while. So please welcome Ms. Stoll. There will be an opportunity for questions after each of the panelists have spoken. There are going to be students who will run mics in the audience. Ms. Bradford, would you like to begin on lessons learned? You have a mic.
That's all right.
Okay.
This is cool. Good morning, fellow social workers. How's everyone this morning? I want to begin by telling you I'm going to take a slightly different variation on what I was asked to do. I was asked to really focus on children and youth. But what I want to do is to talk with you about some of the changes that I have seen in our profession since I began back in 1970. And then I want to highlight what I think may be some lessons that we have learned, or I have learned as a result of that. And then finally, since I was given this particular assignment, I asked myself this question, that if I were 21 years old again, knowing everything that I've experienced in this field, this profession of social work, would I do it again? And I'll tell you that when I'm through with my comments. So I graduated from Shaker Heights High School, and I went to University of Cincinnati. And again, as was said, I went down there at a time that the school just got its accreditation from the Council on Social Work Education. And I was given an assignment, and that assignment was I was going to work in an Appalachian community over the Rhine in Cincinnati. And they told me my field placement would be at a settlement house. And I was very, very excited about the prospect of this very first assignment in social work. And so I took myself on down to the settlement house, and my supervisor said, listen, this is what your task is going to be. You're going to be assigned to organize the women in this community to come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the mothers of the children in the daycare centers, so that they can begin to talk about some of the issues that are impacting them by virtue of the community that they were living in and so forth. And what your assignment is going to be is that you're going to have to not only tap those that are bringing their children to the settlement house, but you need to canvass the community and reach out to mothers all over this neighborhood surrounding the settlement house so that they are aware that this service was going to begin. So I was just very excited with this assignment. And I remember telling my parents about it, and they said, little Miss Social Worker, we're going to send you an attaché case. And I had my attaché case, and I had all my flyers and so forth, and I was good to go. So I began to walk up and down the streets on over the Rhine in Cincinnati, and began to reach out to many of these women that needed information or wanted information, wanted to be a part of a group process. And as I was walking up and down the street, I kept noticing this white car with 4 men in it, kind of like following me, you know what I mean? So I thought to myself, I was aware of them. And then all of a sudden they pulled up on me and they said, hey, what are you doing in our neighborhood? Expletive deleted, ethnic slur. Okay, the N-word. That's one of the few times in my life I was directly called that word. And I turned around to those 4 men and I said, listen, I'm a professional social worker, and I am here to help these women and mothers in this community. I work right around there at that settlement house. And they looked like they had been, I think they were kind of afraid that I responded that way. And they looked like deer in the headlights. And next thing I knew, they drove on. They drove on and kind of left me alone. I can't believe I did that, but that's absolutely a true story. So what I want to tell you is that social work is created within a political, social, cultural, and economic matrix that shapes the assumptions that we're making in our practice. You know, I began in the social work field where we were beginning to use adapted versions of psychoanalytic theory. When I was walking during school during those times, everybody was running around talking about, I'm okay, you're okay. Because we were using a therapeutic modality, transactional analysis. We then, the going rage also were all of the here and now therapies, and one of them being Glasser's reality therapy. Then later on in my career, in the 80s and 90s, there was much more use of the behavioral modalities. I worked at an institution for juveniles, and they use very strict behavioral approaches to work with youth and children that were incarcerated. And I believe that all of these things were forerunners to the current trauma-informed practices that we're currently using. But the lesson to me is that each one of us in this profession have a responsibility to invest and become as skilled as we can in our practice, because it puts us in a position to better help our clients to clarify their thinking. It helps them to be able to impact some of the choices that they are making and to move them toward overall wellness. Another thing that I've observed during these years is that there's been a dramatic change in how we go about documenting the work that we do. And some of us workers that have been around like me can remember back in the days when we were required to do something called process recording. And process recording means that you'd have 75 pages of one interview that you had had with somebody, because you were required to write down everything exactly the way it occurred in that interview session. Then you took that process recording to your supervisor, and that supervisor would go through with you to see, were you asking open-ended questions? Did you guide and direct the interview in such a way that it provoked insight on the part of the clients that you were serving? Anyway, now I look at that, and I look at our use of electronic medical record system. What a contrast that we've made. And I would say this. I would say that although the 50-minute hour has disappeared, there really has been a need for greater proficiency in how we document. And I believe that that our use of medical records has helped us to quantify, crystallize exactly what we are doing with clients in such a way that it can be shared with other disciplines, that we're better able to speak a universal language. And I think those have been positive things that have impacted our practice. And I would say for me, the way we go about documenting over these years has been one of the most significant changes that I have observed in our profession. Then I want to say that as we have in recent 20 years, moved toward fee-for-service modalities, we have been making use of those therapeutic approaches that are research-driven, and therefore we're required to demonstrate that through evidence-based practice that we are able to move clients from one point to another, we're able to demonstrate certain outcomes. But as I look over the field, and this is a Pam Bradford thing, I sometimes wonder if we've lost a little bit of the creativity and latitude that we used to have as practitioners to use certain therapeutic models. The model I think about most when I talk about this, I think about how in the 90s, kind of the rage was family therapy. And at that time, because we weren't quite directed for billing, you could be real creative in how you had whole families come in and you practice. It was not unusual for us to have people on our caseloads that we'd had for 2 and 3 years because there weren't quite the limitations and so forth that are on how we go about practicing. I believe that even though we've lost a little bit of our ability to be creative, it is important that we be in positions to impact decisions that are being made by our funders and by insurance companies so that they know what we need to be most effective as social work practitioners. We've got to be in those rooms where decisions are being made. The field has benefited, though, however, and I do want to say this, from what we've learned from medicine, public health, and research findings. We've benefited from that and how it has helped to guide our practice. One of the things throughout all of this direct service stuff I'm talking about that I think we have not lost, that's very important, is the fact that we continue the core of our profession is the standards and the ethics that are integral to our practice. And that was just as important in the 70s as it is today. And those things that you learned in social work school, social work 101 around clients have a right to make decisions. Clients have a right to self-determinations. you have a responsibility to guard confidentiality in those interchanges. You have a responsibility to invest in your professional development and your practice so that you are competent in working with children and families. And these things are important as we practice the field of social work. They're crucial to our profession, the ethics and values. One of the things that I've always felt is that use of the systemic approach to solving problems, I believe that we social workers, frankly, are the best at it, if you want to know what I think. I think we're the best at it. And I think there are other disciplines that we work with that, of course, put emphasis on the intrapsychic functioning of individuals. But it's our profession that, in addition to that, we recognize the importance of determining how a client or how a service user is connected to their family, their neighborhood, the institutions within their community. We're best at looking at how things relate, the other systems. We don't see our clients in isolation. In fact, if we see our clients in isolation, oftentimes we're missing the boat. So I want to say a couple of things about macro, just a few more things. One, I believe very strongly that there is a role for agencies that provide basic need services. And by that I mean those agencies that are providing services that aren't necessarily in a clinical milieu. Those programs that are providing youth service programs and GED programs and support groups in the neighborhood and education programs in the neighborhood, or providing basic needs, I think that those programs are just as important as the treatment, medically oriented services, behavioral health services that are being provided. The problem is, this is my experience, sometimes it's difficult to influence funders to support these quote-unquote softer services or non-clinical services. That's where our job comes in. We've got to continue to support those agencies that are working to have those support groups in communities and so forth. That's something that I believe is very, very important. I want to say one other thing that I've observed that's been evolving over these years. When I started out in this profession, at the executive level of agencies were people that had degrees in social work and had practiced in the field. And this is why I believe, and as a young, aspiring administrator, I took great pride in looking around me and seeing those at the top that were making the decisions having been grounded in the profession of social work. That meant a lot to me. And I recognize as time has gone on, there is an important need for people to have business acumen and so forth. We know that these agencies are businesses, and that's important. But this is what I think happens. When you have someone that's grounded in this profession, I believe that they are, again, guided by the values, ethics, and standards of this profession, and they are more likely to sacrifice to ensure that the service users, the clients, are given a platform to voice how they view the service that they are receiving. Sometimes it's a sacrifice to bring in community groups, to solicit input on decisions that are being made in agency. I think we did it more in the past than we are doing now. It's important for us to continue to be inclusive, particularly with those who we are serving, and involving them in decisions that we are making about how services are provided. I believe that very strongly. And we also have to invest in young social work students to go on and take that step so that they can operate on the executive level of the agencies that are providing these kinds of services. So the final thing that I would say is that if I were asked that question today, would I enter this field, what I would tell you is that I would do it without a doubt. I would absolutely go back into this field. The reason I say that is we all know, everybody in this room knows we're living in complicated times. We're living at a time where we're continuing to struggle with all the isms, poverty, substance abuse, and so forth. There is a need for professionally trained, competent social workers in our community as the complexities of the social problems that we have continue. So the answer to that question, as long as there's a need, we are contributors to forward progress in the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bressler?
Yesterday, I was talking with my good friend Gail Long, who is a many decade social worker and retired a few years ago as the director of Merrick House Neighborhood Center. And I told her I was speaking today, and I told her I was speaking in terms of what's kept me energized and motivated and alive as a social worker. And she says, it's real simple what you say. Just tell them that it has been because of utter stupidity and sit down. But I'm not going to do that. But what I do want to do first is, I've been brought up to the stage here, and I've been asked to speak here because of my experience as a macro social worker. That I've spent many years doing community organizing of various kinds. I've also been very much involved in positions in the past that have been involved around community development and neighborhood development. And I've also been involved with social policy advocacy. So I've been involved with most of the major areas of macro practice. But I began as a direct practice person, and I want to just relate in terms of how I moved and why I moved from direct practice to macro practice. I began originally doing youth outreach work, working with hard-to-reach youth on the streets. In particular, I focused in a neighborhood that was called the Barber Queen area in Cleveland. And at that time, it was filled with youth. It was a very, very poor neighborhood. And it was also a neighborhood that people looked upon, particularly the police and others, as just a neighborhood that we should forget about. There was high crime that came in and out of there. And so it was a neighborhood that people wanted to ignore. And during the years that I worked with the youth in there, I worked with youth from elementary through their teenage years. I tended to find that my successes were very small and my setbacks were very huge. And I tended to dwell on that. Many of the youth that I worked with were arrested. Some were sent to juvenile institutions, or prisons. That a few died either by being killed or overdosing on drugs or committing suicide. And it just would eat away at me like you couldn't believe. And my mother, who was a social worker, had been a caseworker for Family Service Organization, used to emphasize to me that I needed to separate my professional life from my personal life. And I really wasn't able to do that very well. Adding to this, I made some very unwise decisions. I intentionally lived in the community with which I was working. Not only did I intentionally live in the community with which I was working, I used my home as kind of an informal drop-in center for people that were living in the community. Not a smart thing to do. As a result, I was burglarized frequently. I was held up at gunpoint once. I was twice punched in their face, requiring stitches after it took drugs away from youth, and so it was a difficult time. Making matters even worse is I had the police around there disparaging me like mad, because who would be having these people come in their community or come into their home, and the youth coming in the home, these youth that should be better off in jail or et cetera. So it was a very difficult time. So after 4 years, I got completely burnt out. I'm talking about completely burnt out and talking about completely leaving the field altogether. And I talked to my supervisor at the time, and they had a community organizing position available. Asked me whether I wanted to take that instead. And it made sense. It was kind of easy. I had when I was at SAS as a student, I worked as a part-time community organizer while I was there, and even as a youth worker, I'd organized. We'd gotten the youth together and done a march downtown to secure a playground in the area, and I'd also been co-editing a community newspaper in the area, which helped to give the youth a voice, but also was a basis in terms of organizing around issues in the near West Side area. So I thought this would be great in terms of going out and doing that. And I started doing it, and I took to it right away on a full-time basis and have loved it ever since. And even as the director at Merrick House at the time, there's so many things you can do with organizing that has always made it so exciting. So just as during those years I was as an organizer at Merrick House, just a few of the kind of things that I was able to do. We did neighborhood organizing, dealing with the kind of some of the issues in particular in the neighborhood. That we brought together a coalition to try to organize to get a new recreation center in the near West Side, which eventually happened. That was part of a coalition that advocated on a statewide basis to try to get a housing court in Cleveland, which of course eventually happened. And we put together a coalition in those days. Glue sniffing, which was a major drug issue. People sniffing what was called, the street name was Tuliol at the time, and we put together a coalition to try to get legislation passed that would put a stop to that. And we were successful there. So there was a lot of successes. There were a lot of things that weren't successes. But again, learning from the past, I tried to separate that at that point. Ultimately, as I look back in terms of what keeps me energized and everything today, I think one of the key things, and I think is a key thing for all of us, is that we need to keep ourselves fresh. And by keeping ourselves fresh, I think it's part of that may be, in some of our cases, might be switching jobs when we're starting to feel stale, and it's important to keep us going from that perspective. Or if we stay in the same jobs, looking for new things to do, new challenges to do, new things that keep us invigorated. And I think we always need to be on the outlook in terms of doing that. And I think it's critical for us as social workers to be doing that, because if we start to become stale, then we're not helping anybody. When I teach community organizing at MSAS, I always go through and kind of present 20 principles of community organizing that I think are important for students to learn. And a few of those I think are much more transcendent, and I want to bring up now because I think it brings into some of the comments I'm talking about now. So I want to go just a few of those and talk about those. One is that people are motivated by self-interest. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. And it could be when we're doing organizing, it could be that people are concerned about drug activity in their neighborhood, so they're going to get together to try to deal with that. But it also could be with the same issues that are going on that people are motivated because they've been isolated and they want to be part of a general neighborhood in terms of what's going on, and so that can be important as well. And I think that we as social workers need to be looking at our own self-interest, or the self-interest of our program participants, and how we can feed into that to make ourselves grow, or to make our program participants grow. Second principle is community organizing is a dynamic process. I think social work is a dynamic process. Things today are not going to be the same tomorrow. And I think it's one of the things that makes it exciting, because we have to adapt to that on a daily basis, and I think it's so important. A third one, and as an organizer, to me, it's frequently the most important, is that I believe that anyone can become a leader. Doesn't mean everybody has the same leadership capabilities. Doesn't mean that somebody's going to be able to lead, or everybody's going to be able to lead a rally, or everybody's going to be able to chair a meeting. But everybody has certain kind of capabilities and things that they can use from leadership. And I think we need to feed into those. We need to recognize them in ourselves. We need to recognize them in the people with whom we're working, and build those. And to me, it's the most enheartening thing to happen when I see somebody feed into those. A couple of weeks ago, just as an example, I've been helping to coordinate something in Ohio called the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, which is part of a national Poor People's Campaign. And we were doing kind of a kickoff press conference in Columbus, where people were coming from different parts of the state. And one of the people who was supposed to be talking about their experiences in terms of addressing issues of poverty was not able to make it at the last minute. And one of the people I was driving down with, they said, well, could you speak? We talked a little bit about what she could speak about. She was not generally a good speaker. She did not feel comfortable speaking in a broad group. And she sometimes gets a little muddled, but we worked with and talked about it on the trip down to Columbus, and she spoke and just presented some really terrific descriptions in terms of some of the problems that she's been having in public housing in Cleveland. It did it so well that when Columbus Dispatch did the article, which was printed in other newspapers across the state, that was the person they quoted from the press conference. And that was so exciting to me, and even more exciting to her, and did so much in terms of her own self-confidence and her own ability to move forward. And to me, that's thrilling. Another principle I teach, and one that I struggle with personally, is that we need to believe that human beings, no matter how much we may oppose them, or that we can somehow find some common connection. And to do that, we have to leave our stereotypes at the door. And I think it's so important. It's so important for us as social workers to meet people where they're at, to understand them, to accept that, and work from that, and develop a connection. And by doing that, a common connection, by doing that we can move things forward. And to me, that's something that I'm always striving to do. And as I say, it's still something I frequently struggle with. Another principle is that we should always be organizing toward a positive, not just oppose a negative. One of the things that we've distributed at most of your tables is that right now in Ohio, there's plans to try to require work requirements for people on Medicaid, for most people that are on individuals that are on Medicaid, and we're trying, which is going to, if it goes through, is going to mean that a lot of people are going to lose their health care. And we're certainly hopeful that you'll send comments, that email those comments and look at that and do that. But you may think, well, that's opposing a negative, and it probably is, because we're trying to keep that from happening. But in the long run, it's part of a greater drive to have universal health care in which everybody has affordable, accessible health care. And I think that's what we're always looking for. A big part of what I always tell people is that we need to celebrate in terms of what we're doing. From an organizing perspective, we may have big goals, but I always look for small goals where we may be trying to achieve something big, but just arranging to have a meeting with the mayor, we celebrate. And it's a way of keeping involved. People can invest in people going. I think the same thing is true with all of us. And I wish I had thought about that when I was doing youth outreach work, because I kept on looking back then at all the things that were going wrong with the people I was working with, instead of some of the things that were going right. And if I celebrated that, I might have stayed longer and stayed longer doing that kind of work. And so I think it's so important that we do it doesn't mean that we have to have a party or anything like that, but I think we need to celebrate internally. It's just an example. I had a student several years ago in my macro practice class. It's a class that's required for all social workers, for all social work students at MSAS, that and for many students, it's a real struggle to take direct practice students to take that macro practice class. And this was an intensive week in class in this one, and for the most part, it was a very good class. This student was having a real struggle with the class, and we worked with it and tried to get her going. But she was making incremental changes going through. At that time, there was a paper at the end that kind of encapsulated everything, and we talked about it some. And she asked me questions here and there. When she finally turned in her paper, it was really excellent. Far better than I ever could have hoped at the beginning of the semester from her. I want to tell you, I was high for a week after that. And so being able to celebrate, things like that keep us going. And being able to celebrate what we're doing keeps us going. It's so important we do that. At the same time, we also have to have fun. Doesn't mean we have to have parties, but we need to enjoy what we're doing. We need to develop those relationships with our coworkers or the people with whom we're working, and we need to have fun. Last thing I want to mention, last one of these is that I'm of the firm belief, and this is what really keeps me going today. I'm of the firm belief that we can never truly predict what human beings working together can accomplish, and therefore we can never compromise an injustice. And I think there's so many terrific examples of that are going on, that have been going on. I think that what's happened, for example, in Florida and Parkland, where those students, who'd gone through an atrocious thing, could have sat back and been victims. Instead, they determined that they wanted to see social change, and they've been able to get social change in a state that I never thought was going to happen. Here in Cleveland, a year ago, after when they had the Women's March, that was organized at the time by 2 Case Western Reserve physics students who had never participated in anything like that before. At the time, they contacted me for some advice in terms of how they do it, because they hadn't done it, because I'd organized things like that, and I gave them some advice, but they did it all themselves. And it was a phenomenal event. It was one of the better organized events I've ever been to for somebody, particularly given the light that these were people that had never. So the capabilities that people have is far beyond, I think, than what we necessarily always give credit for. As I look at myself at this point, I mentioned earlier the Poor People's Campaign. This is the Poor People's Campaign is a new campaign commemorating, as I mentioned, the 50th anniversary of the original Poor People's Campaign in 1968. Then we were still dealing with a war on poverty. Today we're having to fight a war on the poor. And so being part of this and being able to work in this really keeps me going. And so finally, in these difficult times, it is so important that we stay engaged. I see like never before that so many of the ethical values that we hold dear as social workers are vital to us today. In particular, the obvious one is the ethical principle that we as social workers have to challenge social justice. That social workers pursue social change, particularly on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed individuals, including focus primarily on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, other forms of social injustice, like never before. But at the same time, it's not the only one. Another example was that social workers need to respect the inherent dignity and worth of a person, mindful of and protector of the individual differences in cultural and ethnic diversity. Again, both of these are under attack to me like never before. So, notwithstanding that I'm pushing 70 years of age, I find myself as energized and committed as I've ever been. And ultimately, I'm optimistic that change is going to happen, and that we as social workers are going to play a substantial role in that. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is it better now? Okay. The more you talk into it.
My story is a little different. I didn't know what social work was because I was interested in changing what I had seen in a state hospital, and I was distressed by the way the patients were treated. And at that point in time, 55% of all the hospital beds in this country were psychiatric beds. So to take on a monster like that was a little unrealistic, but I had the good fortune of working with some other people who were equally committed, as I learned, to changing that situation and developing options for patients who were sometimes had lived their entire adult lives in a state hospital and had no idea how to live in the community. And several of the people who were leaders in the field locally had been interned camps during the Second World War for the Japanese. And they also provided that vision and that leadership, so that their concept of was that patients should actually have a choice. And much of what they did was develop those choices. And that's the environment which I chose to ultimately to work in. And I didn't really fully understand that. When I was in the MSAS, theoretically I was a caseworker, but I managed to take a class and have a field placement or an assignment in group work, in community organization, and I did an independent research project, which in those days you worked with 5 or 6 other students if you were doing a research project. Well, I happened to work in a hospital at that point in time where there was a researcher who was doing other research, and so I put together my own plan, if you like. It was the name of the research study was Anomie Among the Staff of a State Hospital, because it was obvious to me that one of the difficulties the staff had in the state hospitals, they didn't know how to get things done. And it was partly because it was so poorly organized. So I spent the first part of my career working at Cleveland State Hospital, and as was mentioned, ultimately wrote the plan for closing. Well, because I had concentrated so much on choices for patients, that was kind of easy because I'd tried everything. I had family care, what we called multiple living, where we'd move groups of men, 2 or 3 men, to live together in an apartment, and they would share the responsibilities for keeping the apartment clean. Somebody would do the shopping, somebody else would do the cooking. So they were never alone on their own and isolated. Or they might be living in a foster home, or they might be living in a group home. In the beginning, they didn't have any money to live on. There was no Social Security disability. And I went down to the welfare department to talk to, as it turned out to be Steve Minter, and said, you know, why aren't my patients eligible for welfare? And the answer was, well, they're already got a roof over their heads and they got 3 meals a day. Why should we pay them welfare? They don't need the money. Well, they did if they were going to live out in the community. And eventually that policy was changed. In the meantime, my boss, the superintendent at the state hospital, said, I didn't give you permission to get down and negotiate that. What are you doing? I went to, then I got into difficulties because in those days the residential requirements were that you could not have 4 unrelated adults living in the same house together. And of course, if you were going to have a group home or a foster home, it was better, actually, if you lived with several other people that you knew rather than isolated in a home that belonged to somebody else. So I went to the housing department, the zoning department. Yeah, the housing department, the zoning department, and tried to talk them into taking a different point of view. One time there was an inspection, and one of the patients living in the house was cooking the dinner, and the housing inspector got all upset about that. And why not? You should be part of the house and help out and clean his room and help cook the meals and so on and so forth, do errands. So there's a lot of other things that influenced what options we had as a staff or what options the patients had. But ultimately, we took that hospital, which was so crowded when I started there that the patients had to crawl over somebody else's bed in order to get to their own bed. It was over 3,000 people in a facility that was designed for about 2,000. Well, we got that down to about 1,200 by the time we wrote the plan for the closing. And at that point, we had moved out all the people who needed nursing home care because they were elderly or disabled, and all those who could live independently. And we had a core group left of forensic clients who couldn't be placed in the community because they had been placed there by the court. And we had about 500 or 600 that we needed to come up with a plan for, which we managed to do. And we moved the forensic clients out to Summit County, to what was then known as Orthington State Hospital. It was really a farming community, and now we know it as North Coast. And it's so we have gone in this state alone. We've gone from, when I started with this, from every other hospital bed being a psychiatric hospital to having less than 900 in the entire state of 10 million people. So it's now extremely difficult to get acute care or longer-term care in a hospital, which meant we had to come up with other options. And so moving to the mental health board enabled us to develop agencies in the community that were dedicated to providing services to psychiatric patients. And again, a wide variety of them. We had everything from the clubhouse on Magnolia or Hill House to psychosocial rehabilitation programs. We had a group home where all the people, men, lived together and worked. They had the first, what we now call consumer-operated business. And in the beginning, it was stuff like janitorial service, and gradually it expanded to include woodworking and furniture repair. And it's now are part of Recovery Resources. They joined forces with a drug treatment agency. Again, in those early days, the only diagnosis of the most of the patients in the state hospital was chronic brain syndrome. So one of the patients who you would place in the community would go to the emergency room. They'd call me up and they'd say, you know, what's this patient's diagnosis? It didn't tell you much. And it was a real separation of, over time, of those with addiction problems and mental health problems, because the people in the addiction field felt that the patients couldn't take any medication whatsoever. Whereas mental health, once the tranquilizers became available in the early 50s, they all took some form of medicine, whether it really helped or not, or whether it had any side effects such as tremors, shakiness. And we had to sort of divorce the two and then bring them back together again, as we have now with the Adamus board. But so the changes I'm talking about are not just ones that we made as social workers or professionals in the field, but they were changes that were almost external to us, because many of the decisions that were made for financial reasons, not because there was any really thought out program thinking. The big problem with 55,000 psychiatric beds was that made hospital care the most expensive form of care, the most common form of care. So the state moved quickly, mainly to reduce the costs of care. It was the biggest item on the state budget those early days. So those changes have continued to occur, and I left the mental health board to go to work for university hospitals in their planning office. My ostensible goal was to build a psychiatric facility or addition for children, which was to include a school and some outdoor space. And we went around and looked at children's facilities in the that were given as good examples. One of those examples was a state hospital back in my home state of Massachusetts, and they didn't want long corridors, didn't want it to look too institutional, so they built it in a curve. Well, you know where the kids were all the time, right around the corner. And they tore the place to shreds. And the woman who ran part of that program, the school program, was the wife of the then director of mental health in Massachusetts. It was in the leadership of the legislation that ultimately led to the Community Mental Health Center Act. Well, she arranged to have the kids have to go, when they had to change classes, they had to go up 4 flights of stairs or down 4 flights of stairs. And they had 10 minutes to make that transition. Well, that got a little activity out of them. They were ready to sit when they got back to the next class. So, in any event, we decided to build a triangular building, and had the plans all put together, submitted to the state for funding. And then we discovered something, that there was asbestos in this building that had been built in 1952. It was the first General Hospital psychiatric unit in the area. And then a lot of thought had been put into its planning, including that if you put asbestos in the plaster, it's not as easy to destroy the plaster, but it is dangerous to everybody in the building. So they had to tear it down, and that's how I ended up working on this master facilities plan. And there's a story I have to tell you about that. I said to my boss, well, the Boston Society for Architects has done a pretty good job of keeping the old and the new in Boston. And so I looked up to see who was listed by the Boston Society of Architects that maybe had worked on a project like ours where we were doing not only the hospital, but the entire university circle. Was more than just one institution, obviously. And one of them I called was a guy by the name of Peter Hopkinson, who at a cocktail party when I called, and I said, would you be interested? He said, yes, I'll call you back tomorrow. Well, after I had contacted him and we'd arranged for him to come in to talk to our group that was going to select the architect, one of the things he mentioned is that he had worked in Harvard Square. And so I'm at home visiting my father, who was ill at the time, and I take the taxi into the airport, and he says, I don't go through Harvard Square anymore. The pedestrians have taken it over. And I thought, there's a guy who does what he says. Well, I go out to pick him up at the airport when he comes out for his interview, and I want to show him the city of Cleveland. So I get off the highway and drive him down Euclid Avenue from Public Square, talking all the time about, various aspects of the neighborhood and the Cleveland Clinic and so forth. And he turns to me and he says, this should be a string of pearls. And I'm looking at like him, what are you talking about? Well, he did. He went to talk to the city planner at the time, and they came up with a plan for a surface bus service, which you now know as the Health Line, going up and down Euclid Avenue with lots of stops so that you could encourage people to take the bus in the first place, but you could encourage businesses to grow around the various bus stops. Well, it took them something like 6 years to do all the infrastructure and all the changes that they had to do. And they were funded by the federal government, and was kind of named after Stephanie Tubbs Jones. So if you get down to 55th Street to the bus stop there, kind of a big one, you'll see a poster, Stephanie Tubbs Jones, and it turns out that her sorority, what they wore was a string of pearls. Yeah, and a couple of years ago, they announced that it was the best public transportation system that had been built with these funds in the country. So I called Peter and I said, you're not going to believe this, but your string of pearls just got chosen to be the best project in the country. So that was an unintended result of what was focused really on university hospitals and on the university circle. And the hospital was a great success. They had to really replace all of the high technology areas, the surgical suites, the diagnostic suites, things of that nature, because they were no longer met the standards for hospital care. In fact, we discovered during our evaluation of the facilities that the leading heart surgeon at university hospitals was operating in an obsolete surgical suite where the air vent was blowing germs right down on his patients. So he had a very high rate of infections. He was also the one that said to me, if you can cut and sew, you can do heart surgery.
So on that note, we've had a lot of information in about an hour. So we'd like to open the floor up for questions for anyone who'd like to ask our panelists about their experiences. You can ask directed questions or general questions, or questions that have nothing to do about the theme, but more about how you can remain fresh and energetic in the field in this current climate. So I have a question about long-term care. We often encourage our individuals who suffer from mental health issues or addiction to return to the community because we think that, of course, living in a home and housing is great and independence is fantastic. And there doesn't seem to be a bridge between clients who might be able to live independently but may need more support in a structured environment, but isn't quite institutional in terms of a residential treatment program. So from a macro point and a micro perspective, how do we bridge the gap to support clients who fall into that gap?
So that's actually the most recent story in many respects, because in December 2014, the city of Cleveland and the federal court came to and the mental health board came to a consent decree that allowed us to develop the resources for referrals from the mental health side and all the treatment options that we had, and a program for the police department to teach them how to deal with 911 calls, because it turns out when a patient or a family gets into trouble, they call 911 and the police go out, but when they get there, they discover that this person is ill or is taking drugs. And the issue is, where do I take him? Because he doesn't go to jail, doesn't belong there. And he's not going to get better there, unless, of course, he has committed a crime, in which case he doesn't have a choice, although, again, the courts have changed so that they can order a patient or a person to participate in treatment on an outpatient basis, and they only go to jail if they don't show up for their treatment. But that is going to make we spent 2 years planning now. We just submitted the follow-up plan, and we've completed the first classes for the crisis intervention teams that the police department has been training. And that's going to change the whole picture. That's
Thank you.
one of the things that
Ms. Bradford,
good.
my apologies. You can finish. Okay. Ms. Bradford, you spoke about the disconnection between perhaps in the past being able to be more creative in the services we provided and now kind of be stuck to the billing side and fee for service. What can we do when we know that perhaps someone is suffering from trauma, but there is no mental health diagnosis, but they still need support, case management, and services? How do we get around the billing issue, or is there advocacy work needed there?
Well, actually, that's another change that's just occurred. Yeah, have been reading some grants submitted by agencies to United Way, who has revamped their funding so that it goes to health, education, or financial security, if you like, food security. And all of them now incorporate trauma-informed care. and that's based on originally on a study done in 1995, where they actually identified adverse childhood events to the future health of those children. So depending upon the number of adverse events, they could end up with not only mental illness, but drug addiction and chronic health problems as a result of not of these adverse events. And they've even done a study with one of the psychiatrists here locally of people in the National Guard. And so I have a little section of a book I've been working on called Adverse Lifetime Events, because it doesn't stop. If you have an adverse or history of adverse events and you have another one as you're in the National Guard, you're going to have more trouble recovering from that than you would if you'd never had an adverse event. And of course, it's hard to get through life without an adverse event. They're even using it now at the Positive Education Program, as well as others, to help provide more appropriate support and enable the clients to understand their difficulties a little better.
Thank you.
I would just like to, is this thing on?
Yes, you're talking to it?
Okay. Okay. There are two things. I'm a big proponent of prevention. Is it on?
You have to hold it a little bit.
Oh, okay. I'm a big proponent of prevention. And so, and I also am a person who believes in the least restrictive diagnosis. I believe you don't start up here. I believe that part of what we do is we see where the person can best be impacted. And sometimes it's in prevention. It's with support groups. It's with supports. And if that doesn't appear to be sufficient, you move to the next level of care. And so I believe that that's has to be a consideration when we're working with people that have experienced trauma. That you have to make sure that, again, that you are where that person is in designing how to intervene.
Are there any audience questions? Oh, yes.
Hi, good morning. For Mr. Bresson, I'm interested in, very appreciative of your comments about advocacy. That's my primary interest here. I've got a couple of questions for you, now as you see fit. Number one, what would you say briefly about the state of social justice advocacy here in Cleveland / Cuyahoga County? And maybe as a second part of that question, what would you say are the top 3 to 5 social justice issues here today?
In terms of, can you hear me?
Just keep it right there.
Okay. As we look at advocacy here in Cleveland, or in the Cleveland area, I think that I think that there's some outstanding advocacy going on from a variety of areas. I think the Center for Neighborhood Solutions does a lot of outstanding advocacy. I think that that a host of different groups. I think the Adams Board has taken it upon themselves to do some outstanding advocacy in a way that I hadn't seen, that's been kind of increasing over the years and has been outstanding. And I see a variety of different groups that do it in their own areas. I'm part of a group called Northern Ohioans for Budget Legislation Equality, which works to try to get people who are being impacted by the state budget to be able to tell their own stories and advocate on behalf of themselves and be able to tell. And I think that's a critical part of advocacy that we sometimes don't do. It's frequent we talk about advocacy in terms of speaking on behalf of others, but I think doing self-advocacy is just as important, and trying to encourage that is critical. In terms of issues that I currently believe are particularly critical. One is in terms of public transportation. RTA is facing huge problems as we're going forward. There was a Medicaid tax which has been taken out, which no longer exists, and in a year from now, RTA is going to be losing $20 million. And when that happens, if there's nothing to make that up, we're going to see big rates in terms of what we're paying for RTA, and the routes are going to be decreased. In terms of people getting to work, people getting to where they need to go, things are going to be crippled. And so from a perspective in terms of one issue, I think is where we need to be doing vital advocacy. Is trying to get transportation dollars back into the city of Cleveland. I think, as I was speaking earlier, I think that advocating for health care, for Medicaid on the state, but for making sure that we have good access here in Cleveland. We have the most wonderful medical facilities you're going to find, but making sure everybody has access to those and advocating for that, whether it's on an individual basis or a systemic basis, is critical and and again, as health care is being attacked on a national basis, not to mention on a state basis, I see that in great jeopardy. So those are two issues in particular that I see that are very important for us to be dealing with right now.
Any other questions? She's coming. Yeah, you have to run.
So my question is for Mr. Breeze. If anyone on the panel can chime in, please feel free. I have a question. Well, actually, I would like to say if you could give any suggestions or any words of advice to someone like me who is grounded in direct practice but wants to get into macro social work. I find that I'm that student that's having a hard time trying to transition. My heart is in direct practice, but I know that one day I would like to impact in macro, but like I said, I'm just having that hard time transitioning to macro.
One of the things that the three of us were talking about before we came up here was how interconnected macro practice and direct practice is, or at least should be. And I think it's critical for all of us, certainly if we're in direct practice, to be addressing social justice issues, to be telling the stories of our clients or program participants, to try to get social change, even better, to try to get people to speak up for themselves. At the same time, for us who are working in macro practice, so much of what we do as a macro practitioner is working to empower individuals, to help give them a voice, to address individual concerns, and so there's great interconnectedness. And so I think my hope is that we deal with it seamlessly in a way. And so I would advise, as somebody who's in direct practice or wants to stay in direct practice, to particularly become aware and knowledgeable about advocacy and how to be an advocate, whether on an individual basis or on the issues that are affecting, going down to Columbus, speaking at city council, speaking at county council, sending letters, getting our clients to deal with letters, all of which are important ways that we can be making impact as direct practitioners.
I would just add your membership. I think in professional organizations like NASW, if you're not able to do it in the job that you're working, that's another avenue for you to use for advocacy.
I think we have a question in the back.
And I think I can speak very loudly.
Yes, you can.
When I attend conferences like these, I am continuously amazed that we have these discussions and older adults seem to fall towards the back of the line in terms of talking about issues that are upfronted in our face right now. Currently, older adults are the fastest growing population. We will soon outnumber those individuals who are under the age of 18. So my question for the panel, and I have the services that they need in order to continue living independently and safe in their communities and their homes. So what can we do as a nation? What can the three of you offer as a strategy or even just comment on what we should be doing along the lines of advocacy, along the lines of building resources, along the lines of making sure that students who are in the field of social work, who are in medicine, and other areas understand the need that is going to exist when they come out of school and as they continue to age. It's huge. We have already gotten on that train, and it is about to pull into the station.
Okay.
I think that's, there's no question what you're saying.
You got to talk directly into the mic. Just talk directly into it. Hold it closer. Talk directly.
There's no question what you're saying is very correct. And I don't know, if there are sufficient resources now for families, for older Americans to be able to live independently. That's the dream. You don't want to have to go to an institution until you have no other options. And I don't know if our communities are making the necessary investments to ensure that all of the support resources that can allow a person to live in place in their apartment or with some assistance for as long as possible. I get concerned when I hear all these things about Social Security potentially being impacted. Personally, for me, I'm trying to learn about issues through such organizations as AARP. I do believe very much that it is an issue that is worthy of investment and exploration because it is a phenomenon in our community that we're going to have to put more resources in.
I think that clearly those of us as we're getting older, particularly those of us that are part of the baby boom generation, are increasing substantially in size as we're getting older. I don't mean the numbers are. Those of us that are getting older is increasing, and so we have a lot of clout. And for God's sake, so many of us. We're on the streets marching in the 1960s. So why can't we be doing it in the 2018 or 2019?
Yeah.
And so I think it's and so from my perspective, in terms of making those kind of changes, first of all, the key thing that's demographic about us is beyond all others that we're the people that vote, and so people are going to listen to us. And they're going to listen to us whether it's locally, whether it's statewide or nationally. So we need to be clear in terms of what our key issues are and mobilize around them. If we do, it could be, from a statewide basis, it could be around adult protective services, just as an example, certainly one I've been involved with in the past, or others. And certainly, there's a lot of effort around Social Security and Medicare, and those are going to be continuing. But there are also issues that are affecting us locally and statewide, and I think we identify them and we can bring people together. And there's no question in my mind that we can mobilize people and make real change on those.
Thank you. It is now 10:29, and I know we have more questions, and I apologize for cutting them off, but we need to head out to our workshops. So Victoria is going to come up and let you know how to do that. And we'd like to give a warm thank you to our panelists.